The baby had been quiet for 2 days, and Della knew what quiet meant. She had wrapped him in the last of her husband's shirt, the blue-checked one he'd worn to their wedding and later to his funeral, and carried him on her back through the canyon country, the way a woman carries a stone she has no intention of setting down. Her boots had given out somewhere past the second ridge. Her feet had not given out yet, though they had opinions about the matter. The soles were cracked like August mud, and she walked on the opinions of her feet and kept walking. The Chihuahuan desert did not care about her feet. It did not care about the baby. It spread itself in every direction with the flat indifference of a god who has moved on to other projects, its scrub and its rock and its distances unchanged by anything a woman might be carrying through it. She had left the wagon 4 nights ago. Left what was in the wagon too, her husband's body, the 2 oxen with their throats cut, the trunk she'd packed in Ohio with her mother watching and crying, which seemed 100 years ago in another country. The men who'd done it had ridden south. She'd counted 7 horses and had not looked at the men themselves because there are some things you look at and some things you don't, and she had learned which was which. She walked north because north was the direction she'd last seen water. The baby, whose name was Samuel after his father and grandfather both, made no sound on her back. She could feel his small warmth, and so she walked. On the morning of the 3rd day, she crested a rise, and below her was a camp. Not a white camp. She registered this without the panic she might have expected, which told her something about the state of her reserves. There were perhaps 30 lodges arranged in a loose shape along a creek she could hear from the ridge. Horses in a rope cordon, smoke from fires, women moving, the ordinary business of people who had slept and were now beginning the day. She stood on the ridge, and the camp stood below her, and neither did anything for a while. Then 3 women came up the ridge. They came with the deliberate pace of people who are not afraid of the terrain or of her, which was all of the terrain and all of her. The first was broad and somewhere past 50 with eyes the color of old iron. The second was younger with a burned scar along her jaw that had healed into something like topography. The third was the youngest, maybe 20, and she carried a child on her hip that was nursing. They stopped 6 feet from Della and looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at nothing. The oldest woman said something Della didn't understand. Then she said something else. Della said, "I don't." The youngest woman shifted her nursing child to the other hip and looked at Samuel with the clinical attention of someone assessing livestock. She spoke to the older women. The older women spoke back. Then the youngest woman looked at Della and made a gesture that could only mean one thing, and said, in English that had clearly been carried a long distance from wherever she'd acquired it, "We will give your child milk if you marry one of us." Della stood on the ridge in the ruins of her boots, with a quiet baby on her back and a dead husband 4 days behind her, and considered this. "Which one?" she said. The 3 women looked at each other. This was apparently not the expected response. The oldest woman with the iron eyes pointed south, toward the camp, toward a lodge she seemed to indicate specifically. She said a word 3 times. "Anape," the burned woman said. "The chief." "The chief," Della said. "Anape," the youngest woman said again, and jostled her baby, who detached briefly and then reattached. Della looked at the camp below. She looked at the baby on her back whose silence had been going on too long. She looked at her feet and then at the horizon, which offered the same thing it had been offering for days, more of itself. "All right," she said. The 3 women looked at each other again with expressions Della would spend several days trying to read and never quite succeed. Surprise was in it. Something else, too. The burned woman made a sound that, in another country, in another woman's mouth, Della might have called a laugh. They took her down the ridge into the camp, and the camp looked at her and she looked back and neither flinched, which was the beginning of something, though she didn't know it then. Samuel made a sound, small and ragged and alive. She put her hand back to feel him, and he was warm, and she kept walking. The lodge she was given was small and smelled of cedar and old smoke, and the particular animal warmth of a space that has held living things through cold nights. There was a fire and there were furs, and there was a clay pot of something that turned out to be broth, which she drank without sitting down because she had forgotten how. Samuel drank the youngest woman's milk and did not die. This was the first good thing that had happened in what felt like the length of a geological era, and Della registered it the way she registered most things now, as data, as one fact among facts, processed and filed. She did not cry. She had determined somewhere on the second day in the desert that crying was an expenditure she couldn't afford, like leaving a fire burning when you have only so much wood. She slept for what turned out to be most of a day. When she woke, Enape was not there. She did not see him for 3 more days, which was its own kind of information. What she saw instead was the camp, its organization and its sounds and its rhythms, which were nothing like what she'd been told and everything like what common sense would require of people living in this specific country. She watched the women work the hides. She watched the men come in with horses. She watched the children run in packs through the camp with the semi-organized chaos of children everywhere, which was reassuring in a way she couldn't have explained. The burned woman's name was something that Della's mouth couldn't manage and so was rendered, at the burned woman's own suggestion, as Kaya. Kaya brought her food twice a day and sat with her while she ate and talked in a mixture of languages. Some Della understood, most she didn't, and seemed unbothered by Della's inability to respond fully. Kaya had the conversational style of someone who finds her own company pleasant regardless of reciprocation, which Della appreciated. On the second day, a boy of about 8 came to the lodge entrance and stared at Samuel with scientific intensity. "He's very small," the boy said in careful English. "He was born small," Della said. "Will he get bigger?" "That's the general plan." The boy considered this. "My father says you will stay." "Your father," Della said. "Enape," the boy said, as if this were obvious, as if she should have known. She looked at the boy, the set of his jaw, the particular architecture of his face, the way he stood with his weight on his heels in a posture of complete comfort in the ground beneath him, and filed this information away also. "What's your name?" she said. "Chaitan," he said, then he left. On the 4th day, Enape came to the lodge. He was not what she had been building in her head, which had been building something large and ceremonial and remote. He was of medium height and about 40, and he had the look of a man who has spent decades outdoors being looked at by weather. His face had been rearranged by time into something specific, not handsome in any conventional direction, but specific, the way a particular piece of country is specific, with its own worn features and its own logic. He walked as if the ground were something he'd made an agreement with years ago. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, the way a man looks at a problem he has already decided to solve and is now simply measuring. "You are well," he said. It was not entirely a question. "Getting there," she said. He nodded. He looked at Samuel, who was asleep in the furs. "Chaitan says your son will get bigger," he said. "That's still the plan," she said. Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, and was also not nothing. "You should eat more," he said. Then he left. Della sat in the lodge and ate her broth and thought about the nature of proposals, the one that had been made on the ridge, and the one that Samuel had apparently been rehearsing when she'd stopped noticing, the one where he chose to continue. Outside, the camp went on doing what camps do. It sounds ordinary and continuous, and a horse whinnied somewhere and was answered by another horse, and she found she did not have an opinion about any of this, which was the closest she'd come to peace in longer than she could measure. The work of the camp arrived for her on the 5th morning in the form of Kaya, who appeared at the lodge entrance with 2 hides and an expression that meant business. Della had worked hides before, though not this way, and the early part of the morning was a negotiation conducted entirely without shared language between what she knew and what Kaya was showing her, the particular motion of the scraper, the angle, the pressure, the patience the hide required before it would give. Hides require a specific patience. Not the patience of waiting, but the patience of someone who understands that the thing will take as long as the thing takes, and hurrying it produces only ruined hide. She had not expected to have this kind of patience. She found she did. They worked outside the lodge in a thin autumn sun that gave light but not heat. The grass had gone the color of old straw. The mountains to the west were showing their first snow on the peaks, which was the land's way of indicating that it had opinions about the season, opinions it intended to enforce. Anape passed them once in the late morning going somewhere with 2 other men. He did not stop. He glanced at the hide she was working and then at her and then continued. The glance said something she didn't have the vocabulary for yet. Kaya watched her watch him. "He has not taken a wife since his first wife died," Kaya said, in the careful mixed language way she had. "5 winters." "I'm not," Della started. Kaya made a small sound and returned to her hide. "The women on the ridge," Della said after a while. "The offer was that." "The boy needed milk," Kaya said. "You needed a reason to come down." Della looked at the hide in her hands. "We thought you would argue," Kaya said. "White women argue about such things." "I was very tired," Della said. Kaya looked at her with the iron-eyed assessment of a woman who has been watching other people for decades and has formed conclusions. "You were not only tired," she said. This was true. Della did not confirm it. She worked the hide and felt something in the motion of her hands that was almost familiar, not this specific motion, but the state behind it, the state of hands occupied while the mind goes somewhere quieter. She had felt it at her loom, once, a long time ago in Ohio, and here was the same state arrived at through different hands doing different work in different country, and she found this strange and also sensible. Chayton appeared at midday and sat beside her and watched her work. "You're doing it wrong," he said. "Show me," she said. He showed her with the authority of a boy who has watched this work his whole life, and she corrected her angle, and the hide responded, and she thought, "All right then." Samuel slept in the lodge and woke and cried, and was fed by the youngest woman whose name Della was getting closer to being able to say, and slept again. The afternoon light moved across the camp in its usual indifferent way. The horses moved in the cordon. The mountains kept their snow. She did not notice exactly when Anape sat down across from her. He was simply not there, and then he was, with a piece of harness he was mending, and the sitting was so ordinary that she couldn't have said when it happened. They worked across from each other, without speaking for a while. He said, "Chayton has been teaching you." "Chayton has strong opinions about hide working," she said. "He has strong opinions about everything," Anape said. "His mother was the same." She did not ask about the mother. He did not explain. They worked in the afternoon light, and she was aware of him across from her with the awareness of someone who has been telling herself she is not aware and has run out of room to maintain the lie. Not attraction, or not only. Something more geological, the way you become aware of a ridge, the way it organizes the landscape around it simply by being there. "The women on the ridge," she said. "It was their idea." "Yes," he said. "You knew." "Yes." "But you agreed." He looked up from the harness and at her, and the afternoon light did what afternoon light does in the west, which is to make things specific and shadowless and without mercy. "I had seen you on the ridge," he said, "with the child, the way you were standing." She waited. "A woman standing that way has decided something," he said. "I thought it better you decide to come down." She looked at her hands on the hide. "The boy is still small," she said. "He's getting bigger," Anape said. "That's what everyone keeps telling me," she said, and something moved in her that was not quite humor and was also not nothing. And across from her, she saw the same movement in his face, and neither of them said anything about it, and the work continued. She did not want this. She registered it the way you register whether coming in, not the feeling itself but the fact of the feeling, arriving against her preferences, having apparently not consulted them. She had a dead husband behind her, and a too-quiet baby ahead of her, and a country around her that had already demonstrated its indifference to what she wanted. And here was this man across from her mending his harness in the autumn light, and here was this feeling, unconsulted, installed. She worked the hide, the mountains held their snow, the camp went on. 3 things happened on the day the trouble came, and they happened in the wrong order, which is how trouble usually arrives. The first thing was that Samuel laughed. An actual laugh, not a sound that might be a laugh, not the ambiguous noise of a baby finding air, but a laugh, 4 months late and loud and entirely Samuel's, directed at Chayton, who had been making faces at him for half the morning with the dogged scientific persistence of a boy who has decided a thing will work and intends to prove it. Della heard it from outside the lodge and stopped what she was doing. Chayton's face when she looked in was the face of a boy who has accomplished something important. "I told you," he said. She did not cry. She had maintained this policy. But her throat did something and she had to look at the hide she was carrying for a moment before she could look at anything else. The second thing was that Enape found her behind the lodge where she'd gone to collect herself and stood beside her without saying anything, which was the exact right thing to do, and she hadn't expected him to know it. They stood there, and the baby laughed again from inside, and Chayton said something triumphant, and Enape made a sound beside her that she felt in her ribs before she heard it. She thought, "I do not want this," already knowing the thought was a formality. The third thing was the riders. 4 of them coming in from the east along the creek, and they were not Apache. Della knew them by the shape of their hats and the way they rode, which was the way men ride when they are looking for something they intend to take. She had seen men ride this way before. She had lost things to men who rode this way. Enape had already moved by the time she registered the riders, which told her this was not the first time. The camp organized itself with a speed that impressed her, the practiced efficiency of people who have survived by being faster than what came for them. Kaya had the children toward the far lodges. The men were positioning. Enape was at the edge of the camp and 2 men were with him. Della looked at her lodge and thought of Samuel and went toward him. Kaya caught her arm. "Stay here." "My son." "Chayton is with him. Stay here and be quiet." She stayed. She was not quiet in her head, but she was quiet with her body, which is what Kaya had meant. The riders came into the camp and stopped. The lead one was big and sun-ruined and had a beard that had given up trying to look intentional. He looked at the camp with the inventory expression of a man assessing value. His eyes stopped on Della. He said something and then said it louder, and Della understood some of the words, which were about a white woman and what she was doing here, and some of the words she didn't understand but understood from their delivery. Enape listened. Then he said in English, "She is my wife." The lead rider looked at Della. She felt the look like a hand checking the weight of something. "That true?" he said. Della looked at Enape across the width of the camp. Enape looked back. Neither of them changed their faces. "Yes," she said. The rider's jaw moved. He looked at his companions. He looked at the camp, counting things, making the same calculations that men like him always make, a probability and numbers and what it was worth. He decided it wasn't worth it today. They left the way they'd come, following the creek east, and the camp watched them go with the particular attention of people who have learned that going and gone are not the same thing. When they were out of sight, Enape walked back through the camp and stopped in front of her. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the riders, which was without hurry and without flinching. "Thank you," he said, the same way he said everything as fact delivered plain. She looked at his face in the flat afternoon light, the particular weathered specific landscape of it, and felt the feeling she had been telling herself she didn't feel, do the thing it had been doing quietly for days, announce itself, not loudly, not warmly, just as a fact, the way a stone is a fact, requiring no justification. She said, "Chayton says Samuel is getting bigger." And Ape's face did the thing it did that was not quite a smile. "I know," he said. "I've been watching." From inside the lodge, Samuel laughed again, and Chayton made a sound of vindication. And the mountains held their snow in the west, and the camp went on, indifferent and alive, and she was in it.